Okay. I hope that works. Just want to make sure it didn't get stuck or something. Alright, so we are continuing reading through the book of Mark. We haven't gotten very far. I believe last time we only managed to get to Mark chapter 1. We haven't even made it chapter 1 yet. Verse 39. Yeah. Basically covering the very beginning of Jesus' ministry as recorded in the book of Mark. Let's go ahead and, just to kind of set the stage, let's go back a bit and read the last couple paragraphs before this. Let's go back to Mark 1, starting in verse 21. After the calling of Peter, Andrew, James, and John, two sets of brothers, Peter and Andrew, James and John. Now there's more to that call than what we get here. Okay, we'll find out. We'll read in the book of John that the call of those four apostles was more involved than what we read here. But so they went to Capernaum, which is where Peter and Andrew lived at this time. They were not from there, but they were living there now. And when the Sabbath came, Jesus will essentially move in with Peter. Jesus will essentially move in with Peter and make Capernaum his headquarters throughout his ministry, apparently based in Peter's house. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, and not as teachers of the law. And we mentioned last time that means he was speaking in his own name. He was not appealing to some predecessor, to some other rabbi who had said something previously. He was teaching from his own authority. Just then a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an unclean spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The evil spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. I already covered this in the last video, so I'm not going to go into great detail about it again. I will say here, though, I have a cat wandering around. No matter what I do, I always have cats. I cannot win against these cats. Simply can't be done. That my guess is that we hear a lot about Jesus' authority throughout the Gospels, especially here. No, don't do that. When she sees this, she wants to tug on this. And particularly here in the book of Mark, and we see it mentioned with a lot of his actions. Not so much of his teaching. His teaching is referred to, but we don't really get a lot of examples of it. I tend to think, honestly, it's because that to Peter, maybe to Mark as well, Mark got a lot of material from Peter, and they may have just been the sort of men who liked authority, who liked action authority. Some people are like that. Some people are that way. Some people respond well to decisive, authoritative leadership. I don't, honestly. That's not my sweet spot. That doesn't get me. No, just don't do this. Why? You're determined to bother me, aren't you? Like you have to. Go away. Seriously, go away. I thought she'd already gotten this out of her system for the morning. I really did. She was bothering me earlier, and I was really hoping that she had gotten it out of her system, but I don't think she has. She's going to cause trouble. I mean, she's in a fighting mood here. Why do you have to go this way? Why? Why do you have to turn around and go the other way? Thank you. No. It's so annoying. It's constant. It just never ends. It's like having a 1.5-year-old that just never grows up. Three of them. I have 3 cats. It just never grows up. It is always this way. It's constant. Every minute of every day. It's just so aggravating. So exhausting. Anyway. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak, because they knew who he was. He does not want to get his reputation from demons, basically. They are not in confusion or denial about who he is. The people don't know yet. The demons do know. James, in his epistle, will talk about the demons knowing that Jesus is God and the Son of God. So the demons do know who Jesus is, and they are not shy of saying that out loud, but Jesus does not want his reputation to come from demons. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, so they were in his house getting healed until after sunset. By the way, this was apparently all happening on the same day. He went to Capernaum and was there in the synagogue. First during the synagogue on the Sabbath. And of course, on the Sabbath, their movements and their actions are restricted. So after sunset, and then he left the synagogue and went home to Simon and Andrew's house. And then after sunset, meaning after the Sabbath is over, because Sabbath ends at sunset, the people bring Jesus to these people. This would have apparently required or constituted in their minds work if they had done this during the Sabbath. For example, if they had to carry somebody or help somebody, this would have been work, which would have been forbidden on the Sabbath. So they wait until after evening, after sunset, which means after the Sabbath is over. And then, and I don't know how long that goes on until, but even the early in the next morning, before even the sun comes up, Jesus gets up. So he had a late night and an early morning. He's only 30 years old, though. He can take it. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place, where he prayed. Simon and his companions, presumably this refers to Andrew, James, and John, went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." This apparently, presumably, is a bit later in the morning after the other men get up and everyone is looking around for him. Jesus, that is. Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. That's where we left off last time. At some point during this journey, apparently, now everything we've read today so far apparently took place in the span of a day or two. We had the Sabbath. They went to Capernaum. I don't know how long they were there. Then the Sabbath came. Okay, so everything from verse 21 onward apparently was the Sabbath and then the following day. And then Jesus gets up early the next morning on the day after the Sabbath. He goes out to pray. Doesn't say what he prays about. He's just praying. The others find him, and then Jesus says, "Let's go around the surrounding villages." Apparently that all took place in the span of a day or two. And then they did go, I guess, on a tour of Galilee. This is what we would call the early Galilean ministry. Now, at some point, apparently, during this early Galilean ministry, it's hard to say when. It's hard to say if this was the same day, or a week later, or 2 weeks later. Who knows? I mean, it's just, you don't know. But this incident happened, apparently, during this early Galilean ministry. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. And this would actually make Jesus unclean. I don't know. I guess the rules of ceremonial impurity and uncleanness don't apply to Jesus. I'm not really sure. But touching a leper would make one unclean. Let's take a look here, actually. Let's look at some of the rules about people with skin diseases, leprosy or whatever. They didn't really have a lot of rules in terms of like colds or things like that. They didn't know anything about those. You can see a skin disease. I believe the reason why there is so much focus on skin diseases is because you can see them. You can't. Now, we did hear about Peter's mother being ill. She was in bed with a fever. Apparently, that doesn't make her unclean, but having a skin disease makes you unclean. Way back in Leviticus, chapter 13, this is where we get all these rules and regulations about skin diseases and stuff. Chapter 13 is all about skin diseases. Actually, the whole part of Leviticus is about purity laws regarding skin diseases and other kinds of things, but mainly skin diseases. In chapter Leviticus 13, verse 45 and 46, it says, "The person with an infectious skin disease must wear torn clothes, let his hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of his face, and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' As long as he has this infection, he remains unclean. He must live alone. He must live outside the camp." Now, Leviticus, of course, was written while they were still all camped around Mount Sinai. So in Jesus' day, they're no longer all camped around Mount Sinai. So in Jesus' day, this rule means they have to live outside the town. They have to live somewhere out and by themselves in the wilderness. And that is what this guy would be doing. That is why this guy is somewhere outside the village, and apparently Jesus meets him on his way as he's traveling from town to town in Galilee. I don't know how long he'd had this skin disease. May have had it for quite a while. I don't know. May have had it for a short while. My guess is that he probably had it for a while. I don't know. So Jesus reaches out and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. Jesus sent him away at once with a stern warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing, as a testimony to them." That comes in chapter 14 of Leviticus, after we just got done reading. I'm not going to read all of this, but let me just say that chapter 14, the Lord said to Moses, this is verse 1, "These are the regulations for the diseased person at the time of ceremonial cleansing, when he is brought to the priest." So he has to be brought to the priest. And then all the rest of this chapter, well, at least, is about what he does to the priest. On the 8th day, this is starting in verse 10, on the 8th day, this cleansed person, must bring 2 male lambs and 1 ewe lamb a year old, each without defect, along with 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour, and blah, blah, blah. The priest who pronounces him clean shall present both the one to be cleansed and his offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting, or in this case, the temple. So there is a protocol to follow when you become clean, when you are declared clean by the priest after having had an infectious skin disease. And Jesus wants this man to do that. He wants this man to follow these protocols, to do the thing that God commanded him to do back in the desert. Because as of this point in time, that law is still binding. That law is still applicable. The people are still supposed to follow that law. And Jesus didn't come to overturn it. He came to fulfill it. But instead, the man went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. I don't know if that means he did not end up offering his sacrifice to the priest. Or, it says that Jesus told him not to tell anyone. And he clearly didn't do that. He did tell people. Now, whether or not he also neglected to offer his sacrifices to the priest, I'm not sure. Maybe he did that too. Maybe it doesn't actually say that he did not do that, but that might be included in the thought. I don't know. I just don't remember. I don't know. But he did violate Jesus' command not to tell anybody. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. I do not know. I can't wrap my head around how this incident caused Jesus' reputation to spread in a way that the previous healings did not. Maybe the previous healings were all limited to Capernaum, and the people there were all from Capernaum, and the news just didn't spread. Maybe this dude who got healed lived in a big city, and he had a large family, and so the word spread more because when people heard it. Maybe he had been sick for a long time, so it was a really big deal. Maybe he was known to have been sick for a long time. I'm not sure. It seems to me like the news about Jesus would spread regardless. I'm not sure what it was about this incident that caused that to happen, but Mark at least singles out that incident as being what causes Jesus' reputation to spread to such a degree that it was difficult for him to enter towns without attracting too much attention. Let's go ahead and finish off this next section of Capernaum. This is beginning in Mark 2. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, so apparently he didn't go too far. If this is only a few days after the previous stuff, he didn't go too far. Or I don't know. I mean, I honestly have no idea. Maybe it's a few days after the healing of the man with leprosy. Maybe that occurred during his circuit of teaching in Galilee, and this is a few days after that. I guess that's the idea. When Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. So Jesus is now being referred to as being home in Capernaum. That's probably actually referring to Peter's house. Remember, this book is largely a collection of Peter's memoirs of his time with Jesus. And Jesus apparently moved into Peter's house. So that coming home reference there is another clue that these accounts are really coming from Peter more than anybody else. Because he's referring to Capernaum as home, where Peter himself lived and where Jesus apparently moved to. So many gathered that there was no room left, not even outside the door. And he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralytic, carried by 4 of them. Since they could not, so he was lying down on some sort of mat, and they were carrying him along. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus, and after digging through it, lowered down the mat the paralyzed man was lying on. You have to remember that at this point in time, they all had flat top roofs. And I've never been on my roof. I'm 350 pounds. Hopefully I'll never be on my roof. It's weird to me that just kind of, where I live and in the small town Southern Illinois where I live, like you don't just go walking around on roofs. I mean, you might have like apartment buildings and things like that have roofs, and you see it maybe in cities, but it's like for something like that, like the water tower on the roof of the building. They don't really have that here, but you do some places. But like, you don't just go walking around on your roof. And in their day, in their culture, the roof was just another room of your house. It didn't happen to have walls. There would have been a staircase leading up to it. It would have been flat. In fact, a lot of times they did their laundry out there, and they set their laundry out to dry on top of the roof. And the roof would have been some sort of like thatched tile top. So they would have just opened up the tiles that made up this roof. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some teachers of the law were sitting there, thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" That's actually a good point. As much as we like to criticize these teachers of the law, they actually have a pretty good point here. They're right. No one can forgive sins but God alone. You can forgive your brother the sins he commits against you. You can choose not to hold that offense against him. In fact, you're supposed to. You're commanded to. But your forgiveness of your brother does not actually absolve him of his guilt before God. They had a whole category of offerings in which they paid back or paid restitution to the people they had sinned against. I mean, there was a whole category of offerings, the trespass offerings, which were about restoring fellowship between brothers, Israelites, who had sinned against each other. And you're supposed to forgive your brother when he sins against you. But you forgiving your brother's sins against you does not mean his sins are actually forgiven in the sight of God. You don't actually have the power or the authority to declare your brother's sins forgiven. So the only one can forgive sins. So Jesus is saying something pretty drastic here. And if he is not God, he would be blaspheming. If he is not who he says he is, or who he will claim to be, he is blaspheming. At this point in time, this is actually a pretty legitimate... Now, of course, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, are going to get very hardened in their opposition to Jesus, that he is not the Son of God, that he is not who he says he is. But here at the beginning of his ministry, this is actually a fair question to ask. Who can forgive sins but God? The fact that the reason why Jesus said that was to get them to think about that. He even did it that way specifically to get them to ponder who he was. Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat, and walk'?" So which of these two things is easier? Anyone can tell the guy, "Your sins are forgiven." After all, as I just got done saying, you're supposed to forgive your brother when he sins against you. I don't know what sins this guy had committed. I don't know if he had committed a sin that led to him being paralyzed or what. Maybe that was totally separate and unconnected, I'm not sure. But you could say your sins are forgiven, and who knows how, who knows? How can you prove that? How can you prove that in God's sight his sins are forgiven? But, he says, that you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He said to the paralytic, so he's letting that thought trail off. And it says to the paralytic, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." So he got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." So it's one thing to tell a dude who's lying on a couch, unable to move, "Your sins are forgiven. I forgive you." And then who knows? How can you prove that his sins are actually forgiven? It's another thing to say, "Get up and go," and he actually gets up and goes. Something's going on there. And Jesus made that point to demonstrate that he, as the Son of Man, the Son of God, has the authority on earth to forgive sins. So when he says someone's sins are forgiven, it's not just talk. It's not just empty words.